Has your child ever felt like they don't fit in anywhere? Or like no one understands what things feel like? Maybe they feel like they're the only person in the world who looks, moves, or thinks like they do. Cathy Reay, disabled writer, journalist, and single mum to 2 disabled children, wants your child to know that they are not alone. They belong in the world exactly as they are. This is the message of Cathy's new book, How to Be Disabled and Proud, or kinda sorta okay with it. Described as a powerful call to action for both disabled and non-disabled children, the book aims to encourage readers to advocate for a more accessible world and to inspire them to embrace their disabled identity. Written for children aged 9 and up, it's also an essential guide to growing up disabled. From navigating school life and finding disabled community and building confidence, to facing challenges like bullying and discrimination, and learning how to value and celebrate yourself, just as you are. My name's Harriet, host of Contact's Helpful podcast for families with disabled children, and in this episode I'm delighted to welcome Cathy to talk about her new book, How to Be Disabled and Proud, or kinda sorta okay with it.
Hi, Cathy. It's great to have you with us. We're really excited to find out more about your book. So maybe you could just tell us a little bit more about you and your background.
Yeah, sure. Hi, thanks for having me. So I am, for the benefit of listeners, I am a almost 39-year-old white woman with dwarfism. I live in southeast England, and I have 2 children who are almost 11 and 7 years old, and they both have dwarfism as well. I grew up being the only person who was disabled in my family, which I might talk a bit more about later, or at least disabled in the way that I was. And then, the gene was passed down to my own children. And so their experience has been very, very different to mine because they've grown up with a parent with the same disability as them. But there's been lots of things that they still universally obviously experience as they're going through life. And I don't know about you, I'm sure anybody that's listening can relate. I don't always say the right thing, and I'm always quite clumsy, and I sometimes think, oh, I should have said this, or why did I come across in this way? And in parenting, we're constantly learning, aren't we? And that was the inspiration behind my book, really. I wanted to have the opportunity to go away, really, really think about what I wanted to tell my kids about this stage of life that they're about to enter between 8 and 12 years old, and what they can expect, and, support them through it and help them navigate it. And just to have that time to actually, that space to actually put it together in a kind of coherent, hopefully less clumsy way than I would do live.
Absolutely, yeah.
And then also, obviously, to have that then passed through lots of other disabled children and their carers and things like that is fantastic as well. But that's why I wrote the book, really. I wrote it for my kids.
I love that. So you have touched on this in the book, but for people listening, you started off as a journalist. Had you always wanted to write a book, or how did you kind of move from journalism into becoming an author?
So there's this way of becoming an author now that's still relatively new, which is through gaining a presence on social media.
Okay.
And because it's actually quite hard to sell books nowadays, especially nonfiction, publishers have kind of caught on to this wave of like influencers that have a really engaged and established audience already. And so, the buy-in for their book is probably going to be a lot greater than someone known in person.
Okay.
And I was writing kind of articles for newspapers like The Guardian and The Independent and stuff. And literary agents started kind of putting that together with my social media presence that I'd also gained in that time. This was maybe 3 years ago, 4 years ago, and started contacting me and saying, we'd love to represent you and try and get you a book deal, because it I guess, the fact that I can write because I was writing for these major publications, plus I had that
Absolutely.
audience already,
Yes.
they saw dollar signs or whatever. And so I chose an agent to go with, and then I actually wrote a book proposal that was rejected by like 20 publishers. It was rejected across
Okay.
the board.
Okay.
And then I took a year to think about what I wanted to do, and then Puffin, which is obviously a part of Penguin, contacted my agent and said, "We're looking for a disabled author that might have an idea for a book." And then just immediately this book idea came to me, and then after that it kind of snowballed from there.
Amazing. What an opportunity for you to really, as you say, collect your thoughts and get them down on paper, and to have that ready audience. I completely see how that makes sense.
And I think I wasn't ever really, to go back to your actual question, I wasn't really ever like, oh, I really want to write a book.
Yeah.
But I think being part of that kind of, I don't know, that influence of that online presence that I had,
Yeah.
it's so the politics of that is if you gain a certain amount of notoriety or audience, people like message you regularly and say, when are you going to write a book? And then you just start thinking about it. It's not like the get married, buy a house, 2 kids. It's become an influencer, write a book.
Write a book.
Yeah. So I was like, oh well, that's what I have to do now, I guess. So I just kind of did it. And obviously, and like I would never do anything I didn't want to do, but I wouldn't say it was like a lifelong ambition of mine
That's
to do it.
really interesting. But I guess that there are a lot of influencers out there who perhaps don't have the skills to do that. So we're really lucky that you are so skilled in writing and that you can really put these complex, often really complex thoughts and ideas, especially for children, in a really clear, understandable way. So I think the fact that you're a journalist has really helped with that expectation that you will produce a book.
Yeah, I guess so.
Obviously, I've read your book, but for our listeners who haven't as yet, what areas of growing up do you explore in the book? What were key points that you wanted to look at?
So I had the benefit of doing a lot of introspection, obviously, with the book and revisiting my own childhood and that middle grade time where, and the thing that I kept coming back to was that it's a time of change or being on the brink of change in many ways, whether that's transitioning to secondary school, whether that's puberty and your body changing, thinking about gender and sexuality in a different way. There's just so many ways in which we start changing at that age that are, when you are actually the earlier age of that range, really overwhelming and really confusing for non-disabled children and disabled children. And so I kind of knew that I wanted to tackle those big topics because I didn't feel like, I'm pretty sure that they haven't ever been tackled through a disability lens before in a mainstream. And when I was growing up, a lot of the advice and the approach around this stuff was actually quite alienating to me because my experience was so different in many ways. And so that was kind of the driving thing. So I do, as I say, tackle puberty, transitioning to secondary school. I talk about going to the doctor and hospital visits because it's so important to learn how to advocate for yourself in those particular settings. And I talk about, thinking about work and passions because quite often disabled children are made to believe that, maybe they can't follow their dreams or they should limit their dreams or, all of this. And it's so important to kind of say, well, no, you deserve to go for whatever you want to go for. And
absolutely,
whatever that looks like. But I think a couple of the most important bits for me in the book are, one is around building connections with other disabled people. And that's what I found really important when I was a kid growing up in a family that wasn't disabled like me, because I felt so alone so often. to have other kids, even if they were far away, to talk to about stuff was absolutely like essential. It just, I don't know, it gave me life. And when I went to meet them up with them, I felt a level of comfort and free to be myself in a
Yeah,
way that I just didn't feel in my ordinary everyday life being at primary or secondary school. And
yeah,
so that was a big kind of part of the book where I wanted to talk about how we build those connections, what they could look like, and yeah, different routes you can go down to make those connections. And then another part is around kind of activism in a kind of light way. Obviously, they're quite young, but you're
yeah,
never too young to start standing up for your rights and the rights of others. And
absolutely.
and so, and I also don't ever want the book, I didn't ever want the book to have a pity me angle. I want kids
Yeah,
to recognize that this is a really hard time of life. This book is here to support you. But also, there are other people having a really hard time as well. Some
absolutely.
harder, some not, you know, whatever. It's a spectrum of hardness.
Yeah,
And let's all look out for each other and stand up for each other. And here are some ways you can do that.
yeah, definitely. I found the bits about finding other people to identify with and to make connections with really, really interesting because I actually have cystic fibrosis and I didn't know anybody else who had CF when I was little. And then as I got older and I actually had hospital admissions and I met other people, it was amazing. And I didn't realize what I was missing, I think, in that connection. Other people who totally got where I was coming from, what was difficult, why it was
Mm.
difficult. I had no realization that I needed that. And I mean, things have moved on in CF now, and unfortunately, people with CF are not allowed to meet face to face anymore. So they'd have to find other ways to connect. But that connection is so important. And I think, particularly as you say, and the same was for me, you know, if you're the only person in your family with the condition, then you the rest of the family might not realize the importance of finding other people with the same condition as you. And I think your
Yeah.
book really encourages that and really promotes the positives of that.
One recurring theme was always boys, right? Especially
Of
when you're
course.
entering this age. It's funny because I don't even fancy boys anymore, but I did at that time. And or men, should I say? And so when I was at that age, you know, everybody was talking about boys, 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 boys. And that was the conversation actually that made me feel more alone than any other conversation because I always felt like, well, I was made to feel like, you know, I was unfanciable, no
Right.
boys would look at me, you know, all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah,
And having that disabled friend, even though she lived in Newcastle and I lived in Norfolk, and we saw
yeah,
each other once a year, but like having a phone call with her and talking about that was just amazing because she really got it. And no, and my
absolutely.
parents didn't get that because they'd never been through that, you know.
No,
They'd
no.
they'd always been treated as desirable, but like it's very and it's such a big part of that growing up journey that if you are in that undesirable category, whether permanently or temporarily,
Yeah,
you know, that honestly significantly changes the course of those years for you.
yeah,
Um,
absolutely. But that validation from somebody else who absolutely got what you were feeling and
yeah,
what you were thinking must have
it just
been,
kind of reaffirms that, you know, it's not you, it's
yeah,
the system at play here that is,
absolutely.
you know,
Yeah, yeah, definitely. So, were there any topics you wanted to include but you had to leave out? Might there be a sequel?
I really wanted to go more into romantic relationships, sex, and things like that. And I didn't because of the age range.
Okay.
It wasn't appropriate for the age range, really. But I feel like that is something there's not enough literature on, like what does sex look like for disabled people? How do we even just the conversation around that just isn't spotlit
No,
enough.
not at all.
And so yeah, that's something I definitely would love to explore at some point. apart from that, no, I think I managed to include everything else I
You got
wanted.
everything in there. Excellent. The book features interviews with a range of disabled change makers and friends. Can you tell us a little bit about why you decided to include these interviews and include other voices apart from yours? Why was that important to you?
Yeah, absolutely. So I feel like, I don't know, I was very conscious not to posit myself as the disabled person with the disabled experience, because our experiences are so vast and so unique. And I don't know,
Absolutely.
somebody who has dyslexia and dyspraxia is going to have a completely different life experience to me. Or,
Yep.
you know, somebody who's blind and has epilepsy is going to have completely different life experience to me. There's so many, I could go on, but you know, you get the picture. We just, our experiences intersect, and there are things that we universally experience, ableism and inaccessibility being the chief ones. But what that looks like is very different for us depending on the disabilities and the impairments that we have. And so it was very, very important to me to get as wide a range as possible of other disabled people to talk about their experiences, their tips. I've got lots of direct quotes, but there are also bits of the books that I consulted with others but didn't quote them on, so that I could just include bits that make hopefully as many kids as possible feel seen and understood and supported, regardless of whether or not they have dwarfism, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's another really brilliant part of the book are the actual practical tips. Because I think so often we talk about these really complex concepts and difficult situations. You talk a lot about bullying and, you know, relationships and things, and then we just leave it. And we acknowledge how
Yeah.
hard it is, and then we move on to the next thing. And what I loved about your book was some actual practical tips that kids can use to try and navigate these really difficult situations. And I really thought that gave a whole nother dimension to the book that was really, really empowering. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, that's what I hoped for. And I kind of thought about how when I was young, I had very little confidence. I was so shy, and standing up to a bully would have been something that I would just, no, I would literally rather eat, like, I don't know, moldy cheese or whatever. But even if you can't do the tips that are in the book, even just to see them written down, to talk about them with
Absolutely.
your parent or your friend, and to realize that boundaries are an option for you is really important.
So important.
And that's kind of, I was writing it for that bit particularly for me as a kid, but also thinking, you know, I hope that me as a kid would have taken away something, even if she didn't say those things that are recommended in the book.
Exactly. Even if you can't quite voice it, you still have some ideas about how it could be addressed. And I think that it's just another level on from just acknowledging how difficult it is. So as we've talked about the fact that you've come from the kind of navigating, moving into adulthood and teenage years and things, but alongside that, the advocating and standing up for your rights and things. Why was it important to you to include the two different angles in the book?
Because I think they are intrinsically linked. Because if you can't stand up for yourself, even slightly, or get others to support you in standing up for yourself, then your experiences of all of these topics, secondary school transition, puberty, friends, bullies, is inevitably going to be so much worse. And so it was incredibly important to me to have that advice there of exactly what that could look like, and how you could stand up for yourself, and how you could get others involved, and who you could lean on, and all of that. It was so important to have that there, because otherwise it just kind of feels like, oh well, your life's really hard, never mind,
Move on.
Yeah. You know, there are things we can do.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, you're kind of, and please correct me if I've misunderstood, but your message is kind of it's not you, it's the system, it's society, it's the
Sure.
way things are constructed that
Yeah.
makes things harder than they need to be. And I
Yeah.
guess to change that, you have to explore the activism and the kind of, standing up for yourself and making changes. The two go hand in hand. We can't,
Yeah.
we don't want to just sit there and go, oh, well, it's society, it's difficult, end of.
Yeah.
To make
Because
those
what
changes.
hope does that give kids? Like, and what and also we want to motivate this generation to want better for the next generation as well. Quite often
Absolutely.
disabled kids are born into non-disabled families, but if those disabled kids then grow up and want children, quite often they might be disabled as well, and they're going to want better for their kids, so it's
100%.
it's a cycle. It goes hand in hand. We need to be able to plug into any form of no matter how small of activism, even if it's just writing to our MPs, even if it's just going along to the town hall to watch the MP speak and talking to them about issues that your school is facing or the children are facing in school. And it's just so many things. And and a lot of those things, we need a lot of help from adults when we're younger, but it's
Absolutely.
absolutely not impossible for an 8-year-old to get involved. I've been to many things where young children, even younger than that, have been very involved in supporting and standing up for their community. And I think that's really, really important.
Yeah, definitely. You've talked about your parents supporting you through your childhood, and obviously a lot of the work that we do is with parents to support them to improve the whole family holistically. How do you think things have changed in terms of what your parents were dealing with and what you're dealing with as a parent now?
It's an interesting question. I think when I was born, there was still quite a bit of fear, medical fear, around achondroplasia, which is my form of dwarfism. Even though, we'd existed for hundreds and hundreds of years, there are a lot of, my medical teams had never managed the care of somebody with my form of dwarfism. They'd maybe never even met somebody who had my form of dwarfism. There are so many people that have never even met people like me. And there was just a lot of fear there. And I was really, really lucky because my parents were, for their time, incredibly accepted and totally on board with whatever was thrown at them after my birth. They just wanted to make sure I was all right, which obviously should be the standard, but sadly is not always.
Sadly.
And especially at that time, I do feel like we are growing much more. I don't want to say the word accepting, but I kind of open to the possibility of disability rather than running away from it.
Yes.
And I think this is really highlighted by how things have shifted for neurodivergent people in the last 20 years and how, originally we just thought, oh, they've got a mental disorder. Oh, there's something wrong with them. They're really bad children or whatever.
Yeah, they're naughty.
Whereas now, parents are like, okay, I think my child has autism. Let's see if we can get, this and this in place for them. Amazing. It's incredible to see how parents have really advocated for their children in these spaces now. And I think that's really a testament to how far the needle has pushed in terms of, just embracing disability in our children, but also this sense of that fear that I talked about originally. Just maybe you have fear as well, but it's not all encompassing like it once was, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
And obviously I'm speaking generally and that's not the same experience for everybody, but
of course,
that's something that I've really noticed. And I also think, I'm very plugged into the dwarfism community. And when I meet, most people with dwarfism are born into families that don't have any experience of dwarfism. And when I meet new parents, average height parents for the first time, all they want, like my parents did nearly 40 years ago, was for their kid to be okay and happy. Like,
Absolutely.
that's literally it.
Yeah.
And that's great, because you just have to keep that fire inside you, because that will help you to ensure that they are that as much as you can.
Absolutely. And I think that there's a lot more information available now. I mean, just in general, there's so much more information available. But I think, specific, condition specific information is much more readily available. And it's something that, Contact is really passionate about, is making sure that people have that information they need so that they can advocate and get exactly what their child needs. And I think that, years ago, that perhaps wasn't as easy to find, that perhaps wasn't as easy
Yeah,
to
for
come
sure.
by, and you had to do a lot more kind of research and digging on your own, perhaps.
Yeah, for sure. I remember when I was young, like, so BMI, for example, doesn't work for people with dwarfism because our height is obviously a lot lower. And I remember when I was a kid, people were just constantly worried about my BMI. They were just so worried and panicky because it was like off the charts. And they'd be
Yes.
like, put her on a diet or whatever. And it'd be like, well, no, but it's because I'm short,
Yeah, it doesn't work.
But there wasn't that education around it. In the medical settings, there just wasn't that education around it. Whereas now, having had my own children who have dwarfism, it's a completely different experience, and they get it and we get it. And thanks to the power of Google, you can very easily find out what's worrying and what isn't for us, really.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And we just didn't have that when I was young.
No. So again, going back to that fear, probably for your parents, they just didn't have the knowledge or a way to get it easily.
Yeah.
And the medics that they were dealing with didn't have the knowledge. That must have been
right, exactly
concerning.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. So when you talk about friendships in the book and you encourage people to understand that it's a two-way thing and that you have just as much to give as your other friend, or and just as much to give as you have to take from a friendship. I found a lot of what you wrote was really empowering, which is something that we're really passionate about at Contact. Was that something that was important to you when you were writing the book? Is empowerment something that's kind of a key importance to you?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I was a kid, it's interesting because I don't think I can honestly say that I gave as much to my friendships as I expected from others. And
Okay.
I think I believed at that time that I was on the back foot because I was physically disabled, and that, they should give more because of that. And my outlook has changed over the years. And I actually think that that it's never as clear cut as that, because actually, yes, okay, I was maybe the only physically disabled person in many of my friendships or the relationships, connections that I had.
Yeah.
However, everybody goes through stuff. Everybody has stuff, right?
That's so true.
And maybe there was a kid with undiagnosed autism or ADHD or, dyslexia, dyspraxia. And maybe there was a kid who had really, really bad anxiety. And maybe there was a kid who had depression. And maybe there was a kid who was going through stuff at home. And quite often that might not have been visible or apparent or known, but we all have stuff.
Absolutely.
And it was only kind of as I grew up and I kind of learned that actually, no, this isn't how friendship should work. Friendship should work in a two-way way. And it doesn't matter if I experience more hardship than them or they experience more hardship than me. We need to meet each other in the middle somewhere, and we give and take. And so I think that was an important kind of message to put in the book for me, because again, I didn't want it to be this kind of pity me, I'm the disabled child narrative.
Absolutely.
But because nobody wants a friend that's like that. Ultimately, in the end of the day,
No.
they want
But
a
I
friend
think-
who feels, empowered, who can give, who can take, who can give. And sorry, I interrupted you. Go on.
No. I was just going to say, I think that attitudes have and are changing, but I think that your kind of your childhood thought on it was very, very typical of, that is how a lot of people perhaps thought, and that you should be friends with people because that's kind, and I just
Right.
really loved the fact in your book that it was really clear that you've got to give just as much as you take, and you've got stuff to give. That was the other,
You've got stuff to give. That's the other thing.
That's the
Because if you
key.
feel like you're somebody who's deserving of taking all the time, is that also because you feel like you've got nothing to give? And have you been told this narrative that disabled children don't have anything to give? Because that's not true.
Absolutely.
That's not true.
Absolutely not true. No, absolutely. Yeah, I just found that a really important message that I don't see in a lot of other places, and I felt
thank
like
you.
it was a really, really good message to be giving. In the chapter on starting secondary school, you say that accepting yourself is the first step towards feeling accepted by others. And I just think that's a really good way to come at things. And throughout your book, you're so open to people doing whatever makes them most comfortable, So I just wondered if we could talk a little bit more about terminology and the stigma around the word disabled, because I think that there might be a number of children or young people and their families who might not see themselves as disabled, and that might stop them from reading your book or thinking it's not for them. And that I worry about that, because there's so much great stuff in there, and I don't want people to miss out. And I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about that, because we're also sort of within contact. We find people will come to us and say, oh, I didn't realize that, my child's got autism. I didn't realize I could access your services because you're contact for children with disabilities. So we're sort of exploring terminology within contact at the moment as well. And I think it is a real kind of a tricky one, because you're never going to please everybody. But there is definitely societal stigma around that word.
Yeah, for sure. I think, again, in the last 20 years, there's been a bit of a shift, and this is completely in relation to the neurodivergent community and how things have changed for them. And I think that as time has gone on, disabled has become a word that is actually incredibly empowering, because it recognizes that the things that make us different, our disabilities, are not our fault, not something that makes us any less than, are quite often caused by the environment around us.
Absolutely.
Not always, but quite often. And are just something that happens. I think there's almost too much thinking when we say, oh, I don't know if I can say the word disabled. Oh, it's just a descriptive word.
Yeah.
Like I'm white, like I'm a woman, like I'm a mum, I'm disabled. It's just a fact about me.
Yeah.
And it's only when we put some kind of sense of shame on the word that it becomes a shameful word.
Okay, that's really interesting. So you're reclaiming that word.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
But going back to like the neurodivergent community, so again, as we've seen this kind of shift of education around neurodivergence, and more families realizing that they have neurodivergent children, or even that they as adults are neurodivergent themselves, and things like that, there's also this thing of like, oh, but I don't know if I can call myself disabled, I'm not ready to call myself disabled. And there's a lot of kind of there's a lot of conversation around that, and it was so important to me to have several people in the book who are neurodivergent speaking on different matters, because everybody is welcome in the disabled community. And actually, I think we think of disability is this really like loaded thing where it's
Yeah.
like, oh, it's just about wheelchair users or people who are terminally ill or,
Yeah.
you know, people who have dwarfism. And that's what disability is. In reality, we all experience disability in our lives, whether currently, in the past, or in the present, or in the future. We experience it constantly. Whether, you know, let's say you're somebody that gets frequent migraines, you are then
Yes.
disabled by your migraine when you have it. If you have
Yeah.
endometriosis, you're disabled when you're having a flare-up.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, there are so many things that we are disabled by that go on inside our bodies, and in our minds. And I think the more we kind of realize that disability lives inside the home as well as outside the home and in every home, the
Yeah.
more we kind of, I don't know, take away the bigness of it, the
Yeah.
size of it. It feels
Yeah.
so big.
It does.
Yeah, I don't know if I've explained that well, but I think disability is something, it affects all of us almost, you know, very, very regularly.
Yeah.
And that is something we need to talk about. That is something we need to normalize because it's just a fact of life.
Yeah, that is absolutely how we feel at Contact. But and we've got to take these steps to spread that word and spread that kind of acceptance and yeah, and destigmatize it. Okay, that is all of my questions. Was there anything you feel like I haven't touched on or that you wanted to talk about further?
I suppose I wanted to say, which is a message I put in the book as well, that I thought it would be nice to have here, as I recognize that a lot of people listening to this will be parents. I guess I want to say it can be really hard being a disabled child. It can also be quite hard being a parent of a disabled child at times.
Yeah.
Whether you're yourself disabled or non-disabled, there's a lot on your shoulders. And I think I want to hold space for that and recognize that, you know, parents are doing a great job. And yeah, you're going to mess up. I messed up. And I even have the same disability as my kids. You know, I messed up all the time. I'm going to continue to mess up. And so are you. But I think the fact that you're listening to this, the fact that you might engage with my book is amazing. And these kind of steps are like crucial in kind of unlearning some of the things you might have learned about disability in the past that aren't true. And also learning, you know, how you can advocate for and support your child in the best way possible. So yeah, thanks for listening and thanks for being here.
Oh, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much. I will encourage everybody to read your book. It is so empowering and inspiring and a joy to read. It's funny and there's lots of interesting points and practical tips, which I think are so helpful. I am a huge fan. So thank you very, very much for giving your time today.
Thanks so much to Cathy for joining and telling us all about her book, How to Be Disabled and Proud, or at least kind of sort of okay with it. It's available in all good bookshops and as an ebook and audiobook too, narrated by Cathy herself. Ahead of Cathy joining us, we were happy to be able to give away some copies of her book on our Facebook page. To enter our prize draw, we asked you to share something your disabled child achieved that made you super proud. A huge congratulations to Lindsay, Jill, Lisa and Karen. I hope you enjoy your copies and please let us know what you think. Here are a selection of some of our favourite moments you shared. Vanessa said, I am so proud that my son now trusts me with his feelings. He told me when his tummy hurt because he was anxious. He told me he was afraid to ask for help at nursery because he felt overwhelmed. I'm so proud of that. Jane says, my disabled child is now 34. She has a job as a midday supervisor at a local special school. She absolutely loves her role in the school. Karen is proud of her son James, who draws and paints and sells his artwork to raise money for charity. And Harley was proud when a staff member at her son's school told her he's a gorgeous young man with a lovely soul. And Mazena says her boy's achievement was finding his voice by not accepting everything. He is non-verbal with limited communication. He stopped accepting any colour of his bowl. He makes a choice by pointing at the one he wants. I know it's just a colour of a bowl for some, but this is just the beginning of him finding his voice. I am proud of him for being him. Finally, we were very excited to get this voice note.
Hi, my name's Logan. I am 10. I have achondroplasia like Cathy. Her pick is brilliant. I have, but if I won another one, I would give it to my school. I am proud that I am fit and healthy.
We love all these achievements. Thanks so much to everyone who contributed. You can read them all on our Facebook page. You can find advice on the topics raised in this podcast on our website. Visit www.contact.org.uk/advice. That's it for this episode. Thanks for listening and see you next time.